Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be analyzing Destiny's final, and I do mean final, weapons sandbox. And this marks the beginning of the end for this meta-analysis series that we've been doing on the channel for the last couple of years. And so I wanted to do this one justice. So two things. The first thing is I made a little slideshow for you guys. Normally the archetype tier list, they're kind of a drag to watch, right? Very data-driven, very dense. And number two is there's a lot more factors to consider for this archetype video compared to normal. Because it is the final sandbox, I decided that I would take into account artifact mods, since they will be permanent. They will be evergreen for the rest of time until the server shut off. And of course, there's other stuff too, like the intrinsic stuns that have been added to every single legendary archetype, whether it's high impacts getting unstoppable or adaptives getting barrier. That does matter to some degree in a lot of content. So I'm going to cover that as well in a future section in this video. But besides that, this is going to be pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and take a look at our outline. Before I mention what I'm going to talk about in this video, I do want to just make things clear. This archetype tier list, as it has been in the past, is largely academic in nature. It's mostly to provide us with some base information on how a weapon performs just without any perks kept in mind or without any origin traits kept in mind or anything specific like that. And just looking at its base performance in the sandbox. And so if I say that an archetype is not rated very high or I don't think it's very good, that doesn't mean that every member of that archetype, every, lightweight bow, for example, is instantly marked for death or anything like that, right? It's and this is just a kind of starting point to look at weapons through as you build upon them with stuff like perks and origin traits. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at the 4 topics we're going to be covering in this video. The first one is going to be methodology. So this is a walkthrough of the archetypes tab in the actual endgame analysis spreadsheet. I get a lot of questions like, oh, Aegis, what does minor scalar mean? What does MDPS mean? What does EDPS mean? What does 1 mag mean? And so I want to explain what all these terms mean so you guys have an understanding. If you guys want to actually visit the spreadsheet yourself, it's going to be linked in the description, as well as this presentation. The spreadsheet, a lot of complicated, weird headings and terms in there. So if you want to keep up with what's going on in terms of my justification and conclusions in some of these analyses, then the methodology section will hopefully help you out with that. We have the families section, which is mostly to figure out within a specific weapon archetype family, so maybe like auto rifles, what is the best one and why. So this is not really going to be considering like artifact mods. This is just within a specific family of weapons. Which one should you be looking for? Because typically artifact mods, they're not just like only high impact autos get a buff, right? It's all auto rifles get a buff. So we don't really need to account for artifact mods. We're just going to be looking at individual within a group kind of scoring. Next, we have interactions, which include artifact mods, notably, like I mentioned. We have intrinsic breaker types, subclass buffs like Mobius Quiver. You have exotic armor like Lucky Pants, and other factors, anything that doesn't really just include only the base damage profile. And then finally, the 4th section we're going to talk about is the actual tier list itself. So if you want to skip to that, there will be timestamps, but the tier listing of archetypes against each other with everything that we've learned combined, all the knowledge that we've amassed through discussing the families and interactions. And we're going to figure out what archetypes are actually the best in Destiny's final update. Let's go ahead and get started with our spreadsheet walkthrough. The first section here is mostly like info, so pretty straightforward. Icon, frame. We have intrinsic breaker types, so stun, as you can see, adaptive auto rifles. There's a barrier symbol next to them. And then we have mag percent, which is a little bit interesting. Now, we are in a sandbox right now where the mod abundant ammo exists. And as a result, you don't really always take backup mag on every weapon like you used to. And because it's not the default, I wanted to measure the effect of enhanced backup mag on a weapon so you can kind of make the decision for yourself, and also helps me make the decision whether or not you want to take backup mag or maybe abundant ammo. How impactful is this mod on the mag size of a weapon, especially with weapons that maybe start out with a pretty low mag size? And so that's the point of modded mag percent. It just tells you the percentage increase when you use enhanced backup mag. We also have enhanced heat generated for heat weapons. Heat weapons obviously don't have backup mag, so I used an equivalent. You'll notice that enhanced heat generated is significantly less impactful than enhanced backup mag, but I thought I'd include it in there anyway because I'm sure somebody was curious. And then finally we have ammo type, which is super straightforward. Next we have values part 1, so this is where actually some of my measurements are going. Base damage is going to be the damage of a single shot, or in the case of like a pulse rifle, a burst, versus a boss target at the +0 level of difficulty. So that's going to be most raids and dungeons. If you just shoot a boss in the head with this weapon, you're going to be seeing the same number that I'm presenting here. And then we have scalars. Scalars is every weapon does a different amount in terms of like a multiplier to red bars and orange bars compared to bosses. And this number can drastically swing. You can see on the right side here, there's a weapon with a minor scalar of 1.2, and there are some weapons with minor scalars of 3.43. So very high, very different. And this can change red bar performance, ad clear performance, or this can change even elite, ad clear performance. So this is definitely going to be a factor that tends to matter when we're calculating minor and elite DPS. Next, we have crit multiplier, which is fairly straightforward. I think the only maybe not obvious thing that you might be asking yourself here is if there's a weapon with splash components, for example, like a rocket sidearm or a rocket pulse, the crit segment, right, it's actually all combined in the crit multiplier. So it's effectively, if you shoot an ad in the head with a rocket sidearm, we're not going to be just looking at the impact portion that can crit. It's just the total damage of a crit shot versus the total damage of a body shot divided. That's going to result in the crit multiplier. Max ammo is the highest possible reserves on every archetype. Shout out to my friend Spider for maintaining a spreadsheet that tracks the maximum reserves on a bunch of different weapons with a bunch of different mods. I wrote some exceptions here because there might be like 70 machine guns in an archetype, and maybe only one of them is capable of reaching 461 ammo, while all of the rest of them reach 460. And that 461 ammo setup is like kind of unrealistic. Maybe it's like a weird mod setup and a weird mag combination. So if it's something like that, I'll just go with the 460 number. For the most part, it was pretty cut and dry though. Most, for example, rapid fire snipers hit like the same total reserve cap. So it's really pretty straightforward. And then intervals. Intervals is kind of cut off with the next section, but this just refers to the time between shots by default to find fire rates. So for example, the top weapon on this list takes 100 milliseconds between every single shot. That would be like its fire rate. So its fire rate is like 10 shots per second. Next, we have the optimized interval. Optimized interval is going to refer to, this can refer to a bunch of things, but it's basically the fastest you can shoot the weapon back to back, even when weapons, they're normally not shot that way. So for example, as a rocket, right? Rockets typically have a mag size of 1, and you're not shooting them back to back. But if you have an overflowed mag using reconstruction, time loss magazine, overflow, etc., how would you be able to shoot the weapon? Like how fast could you shoot the weapon? So this is a lot more close, this optimized number, to what max DPS tends to look like on boss damage weapons. For example, on rockets, a lot of the time on Hezen, you're using like Envious, or you're using, some sort of overflow technique like time loss magazine in order to get the maximum DPS. In the case of some weapons, you have a fire rate mod. For example, linear fusion rifles and regular fusion rifles. I'm sure you might be curious what that charge rate or charge time mod does to the weapon. And so I've actually measured this, the change in the time between shots for an accelerated coils fusion with this mod versus not having this mod. And so that might be of interest to you. It doesn't really change the DPS much, to be honest, but I included it in there just in case. And then also for weapons like the high impact sniper, so the helmsman, if sprint canceling and lunefactions actually increases the fire rate of this weapon effectively, then I also included that in the optimized interval column. So this is basically like, if you actually tried your hardest to make this weapon and squeeze as much, damage out of it as you could, what would the time between shots actually look like, right? Which most weapons, the fire rate doesn't change, but some weapons it does. So I wanted to include that as part of the spreadsheet. Next, we have values part 2. So true RPM is just automatically calculated from the base interval column that you saw earlier. So it's just calculated using mag dump time. So you'll see here mag dump time, there's base dump and modded dump. That simply refers to the time between the first shot in a mag and the last shot in a mag. So if I have a mag size of 30, I divide that time period by 29 because there's 29 gaps between 30 shots. And that gives me the approximate time between every single shot. I obviously record it across an entire mag because if I'm recording at 60 FPS and I'm recording only the time between 2 different shots, there's going to be a lot of error. Whereas if I use an entire mag, there's a lot less error. So that's how I found the true RPM, quote unquote true RPM. Most weapons, the RPM is accurate in game, but some weapons, not so much. The magazine size, this is tested mag versus modded mag, as you can see on the right side here. Tested mag just refers to the actual real example of the weapon that I got and fired in order to get this, these testing values. What was the mag size, right? That's tested mag. And then modded mag simply refers to if you have an example of a weapon and you don't have any sort of mag perk on it, like an extended mag or enhanced heatsink or something like that, and you use the mag mod, so it's either enhanced backup mag or enhanced heat generated, what does your mag actually look like? So I wanted to get basically the biggest realistic mag while still having access to something like high caliber rounds, if that's something that you want to do. So this is kind of just a baseline for every single weapon. Like what does a big mag, quote unquote big mag look like? Next, we have the reload timing, which is the time between the last shot of the first mag and the first shot of the next mag. The base reload timing is going to be with 100 weapons and 1 loader mod, and the modded reload section is going to be specifically for lunefaction boots. So one of these represents like if you're out in the world and let's say you have a sidearm and you're out in the world just shooting ads, you're more than likely going to have at least 100 weapons because that impacts your reload and handling stats. And then you also are probably going to have at least 1 loader mod on, but you might not have any other reload boost, right? You're obviously not going to have a lunefaction rift all the time when you're out and about just shooting a primary. So this is supposed to represent your typical use case of just running around and shooting ads and reloading. So this is going to be more important for like primaries when we look at them, because some primaries are more heavily impacted by their manual reload time compared to others. And the lunefactions is more going to be like maybe for linear DPS, for example, that might play a bigger role when it comes to analyzing boss damage profile, because that is a weapon where you're more likely going to be in a Lunafaction while using it, and maybe spam reloading it every time you dump a mag. So just some important things to consider here. That's reload timings. If you're looking at the little numbers next to the reload values on the right side here, next to base reload, those are just going to refer to the actual reload stat of the weapon that I used. Anything that has 3 numbers is going to be like a heat weapon. So the top weapon is the vent speed, then you have heat generated, then you have cooling efficiency. Dump time, like I mentioned earlier, is just the time between the first and last shot in the mag. And then finally, we have a little bit of ammo stuff, which is the maximum amount of ammo you can get from 1 brick with 200 weapons and a scavenger equipped. I will say I didn't see any variance at all between brick pickups every time I used a bunch of different weapons, including like even machine guns, which have a very fine level of potential change because it's like hundreds and hundreds of ammo as opposed to like a sniper, which has like maybe 30 or 40. And so, yeah, I just kind of put the first number that I got, which doesn't really tend to vary. And so it says max brick, but really it's just the amount that you would get from 200 weapons plus scav. There's no like variance. Okay. Next up, we have calculations. So this is probably the most confusing section for a lot of people, and I'll make it really simple. So there's MDPS, EDPS, BDPS. MDPS is DPS to miners, red bars. EDPS is to orange bars and the like. And then BDPS is to bosses. And the little tags modifiers that you see at the top here, 1 mag means damage within a mag. So DPS within a mag without reloading. If you could just spam shoot a weapon at its maximum fire rate, what would be the DPS of this weapon during that time period? A good example of this is something like a heavy GL. A heavy GL, you're more than likely not going to be reloading it. You might be using a perk like Envious Arsenal. And if you're using a perk like Envious Arsenal, then you never really need to account for the reload time. And so the 1 mag DPS is going to be what you're going to be considering when it comes to analyzing its boss damage profile against other heavy weapon archetypes. Next, we have maximum DPS. Maximum DPS includes stuff like maybe Rain of Fire or Overflow or mods. So anything that you can do to optimize and squeeze out more damage out of this weapon. For example, with rockets, right? I may be considering just shooting the rocket back to back with like Sentinel Shield or something like that. So just the maximum DPS you can pull from this weapon, that's going to be the max DPS column. Next, we have Luna, which just refers to manual reload, but with maximum reload circumstances. So I didn't use like Rally Barricade or anything, but Lunafaction boots give you max reload, and they also give you a reload duration reduction in terms of like a multiplier. So Lunafaction is there as well. We have typical DPS, which, like I mentioned earlier, is just 100 weapons, 1 loader. Just represents how you'd use this weapon if you're just running around and manually reloading it between killing ads or something like that. So yeah, that's DPS values. Next, we have ad clear score and boss damage score. And the ad clear score is 3 components. 40% of it is typical minor DPS. So like I mentioned earlier, what typical means. 40% 1 mag minor DPS and 20% typical elite DPS. And the reason why I split it this way is because obviously red bar ad clear is a lot more important than orange bar ad clear for most primary ad clear circumstances and just ad clear in general. And then for typical versus 1 mag, some weapons and some scenarios, they're favored by being able to have very high 1 mag DPS, because maybe you have an ad spawn where you can kill everything in 1 mag of a primary or 1 mag of a special or whatever it is, and then you have a downtime period where you are free to reload and you're not really losing effective DPS or uptime by reloading during this period. However, there are some situations maybe in harder content where you do actually need to account for this kind of manual reload period. And so that's where that typical minor DPS comes into play. So I didn't want to punish one style of weapon more than the others. For example, if I only looked at typical minor DPS, then heat weapons would be underperforming compared to where I think they really do perform in terms of ad clear in the real world. And so as a result, I decided to split them kind of 1 and 1. And they also have a section for elite DPS because some weapons, some primaries like hand cannons are a good example, have higher elite scalers than others. And that does tend to matter in some content, in some contexts. And so I wanted to give some points for that, even though it's only 20% compared to the 80% that is covered by minor DPS. The ad clear score also accounts for artifact mods. So for example, Argent Quiver is in an artifact this season. And so Argent Quiver is a 35% boost to primary bow damage. And paired with semi-auto striker, this means that you basically permanently have it up. And so I was willing to multiply the bow scores by like 35%, 1.35 times. And so this made them a lot more viable and will affect rankings in the future. Now, the next slides that we're going to look at when we're looking at just within the families, the ad clear score in these sections does not have artifact mods included. So maybe don't compare them 1-to-1 across slides. But for the most part, we're just looking at, within a single family. So bows versus bows, auto rifles versus auto rifles. So that ad clear score being multiplied by artifact mods shouldn't really matter. Next, we have boss damage score, which is a lot less complicated. This basically just takes the most relevant boss DPS column, which is most likely going to be either 1 mag or max, and also accounts for artifact mods. So for example, rockets have Argent Ordnance this season. I multiplied their boss damage score by 15%, so 1.15. Okay, so that is almost it for the walkthrough. We have 3 more things to talk about, very short. First thing is total damage, which is maybe not as relevant as it used to be for sure. But total damage against red bars, that's going to be important for stuff like rocket pulses, area denials. And then we have total damage against bosses specifically. So, obviously for boss DPS, this doesn't tend to really be that big of a deal because most weapons can keep up in terms of total damage against bosses these days. But if a weapon's total damage is really terrible and it's like abysmal, that can impact its rating and its ranking. We have damage per brick, which is an interesting measure of ammo efficiency. So this is the amount of effective damage you get. So this is calculated using the max brick thing that I mentioned earlier. We multiply that by damage per shot. And some weapons have drastically different amounts of ammo that they get from every single brick. And so as a result, some weapons, maybe they have a lot of total damage, but they have terrible ammo brick conversion efficiency. And if that's the case, then that might negatively impact this weapon's, at least my opinion of this weapon's ammo economy. I will say this is mostly like an academic stat, so it doesn't really affect the rankings too much, but there's at least one academic comparison that I made in this presentation that might be of interest from this stat. And then finally, we have average fall-off range. Now, a lot of these are missing because I didn't update these for newer archetypes, and someone sent me the average range that weapons start to experience damage fall-off with no range modifiers for every single archetype. So they took all the 140 hand cannons, for example, at the time, and averaged their fall-off, their range fall-off, their maximum range cutoff. And so they sent this to me, and I put it into the spreadsheet. And so while this doesn't necessarily impact most weapons, like a lot of like sidearms, for example, occupy the same range tier, when we're comparing weapon families to each other, you can make arguments like, for example, the sidearm family might be more potent than the SMG family because they occupy the same range tier, but sidearms have better damage profiles. Or you might want to argue even within the same weapon family, like, for example, pulse rifles. If the heavy burst pulse rifle outranges the rapid by 10 meters and they have similar damage profiles, then even though range is not really that big of a deal in PvE, you can say, the heavy burst has this as an advantage, and so I'm going to rank it a little bit higher than something like the rapid fire pulse, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's it for the walkthrough. And before we get started talking about weapon families and comparing autos to autos and figuring out which archetypes are the best, what makes an archetype good? So I spelled it out for you kind of clearly in the walkthrough, but it's going to be add clear score mostly for primaries. And the nice thing is that this add clear score accounts for manual reload. It accounts for burst damage in primaries just across one mag, and it also accounts for elite DPS as well to some degree. So normally I'd list maybe a couple factors in here, but the add clear score thing kind of adds them all up in a nice proportional way. We also have one mag or max BDPS, depends on the weapon type. For rockets, you'd be looking at max BDPS. For GLs, you'd probably be looking at one mag BDPS. And then finally, we have boss total damage. I put a little star here because this tends to not matter as much these days, like I mentioned, but it might come up in one or two discussions if boss damage total is particularly abysmal. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start looking at weapon archetype families. First up, we have auto rifles. Now, auto rifles, if you look at the add clear score here, there's kind of three main groupings. In the great tier, we have adaptives, high impacts, and rapids. In former seasons, rapids were definitely the kings of auto rifles, but there have been some RPM reworks to like the high impact. There have been some buffs to other archetypes. And so as a result, very, very close together in terms of add clear score, very, very similar. Decent, we have support. Now, of course, support has that intrinsic where you can heal your teammates, give them effects. You can give them a damage boost that stacks with everything, 10%. So because of that, maybe you want to rank the support auto like a little bit higher in your head, given that the damage profile is really not that different from the other autos. It's also a projectile weapon though, so, give it or take it. There's a couple things here. And then you have balanced autos at 691, and then you have precisions at the bottom of the pack at 673. Now, granted, these differences between these archetypes are not that large, but I wanted to create these like little separate groupings so you guys have a better understanding of like what archetypes are the best. When it comes to at least just raw mathematical performance, there's going to be other stuff that impacts, which, I'm going to write in the notes here, as well as intrinsic breaker stuff, which we're going to talk about later. But this is the starting point at which we're going to view these weapons through. Note-wise, support autos have more forgiving crit multiplier than the other auto rifles in this grouping. All the rest of them have 1.7 to 1.8 times. Support auto has 1.4 times. Being a projectile weapon, this is obviously quite helpful, but a little something to note there. And then the high impact auto rifle compared to most other autos has significantly more range, up to 10, maybe even 11 meters more, at around 36 meters on average compared to the 25 or 30 you would see from most auto rifle archetypes, which is nice. It's a nice advantage given that, the damage profile is essentially the same as a lot of the top auto rifle archetypes, like the rapids and the adaptives. Next up, we have bows. Bows, there's only 3 archetypes, but one stands clearly above the rest, and that's the precision at 739, with the lightweight and high impact trailing behind significantly at 685 and 682. Now, note-wise, the lightweight bow actually has a less forgiving crit multiplier than the other 2 archetypes at 1.6 times versus 1.3 times. One of the biggest downsides of the lightweight bow archetype specifically is that it, in theory, has a lower draw time floor than Precisions, but if you have a good rolled Precision, they tend to actually fire at essentially the same fire rate, even if you are going for good perfect draw timings. And so Precisions tend to just have higher DPS in general because they don't tend to waste as much of their draw time floor, and they obviously have higher damage per shot than the lightweight. High impacts, it's kind of like a feeling thing, but they have less forgiving and obvious perfect draw timings, and their increased draw time, initially at least in combat, is definitely a downside when it comes to a lot of endgame content where you want to be snappy and responsive with your weapons, and so that's obviously going to be a downside in the future when we discuss this for tiering purposes. Next up, we have hand cannons. Hand cannons, I want to point out the spread shot here, which is excellent at 1259 on the ad clear score ranking. This is an extreme outlier compared to a lot of other primaries here. You're scarcely going to see anything else break even 1k. So very impressive from the spread shot. Obviously has limited range, as you can see in the notes here, significantly worse range. And I will say a lot of people don't like spread shots because they feel very clunky. And you might be asking, oh, Aegis, that's only 1260 because you're not accounting for the reload time. I actually am accounting for the reload time, even with how slow spread shots reload, and they have that terrible, slow, clunky reload animation. Even without accounted for, their overall ad clear score is still this high, which is kind of incredible, honestly. So yeah, spread shots, they honestly hit like a truck. They hit like special level tiers of minor DPS in some cases. They obviously have their trade-offs, but I just wanted to point them out as being pretty good if you use them within the correct range tier. And then we have great hand cannons, heavy burst, dynamic, adaptive, precision. I was a little surprised to see 140s above 180s. In my head canon, at least, 180s are a higher DPS archetype than 140s, but they're essentially identical. So, that's good to know. And then aggressives are really, really, really trailing behind the pack here at 706. Quite a big gap here for the 120s, but that tends to make sense. I think a lot of people understand that 120 RPM hand cannons are not very good mathematically in PvE. Spread shots, dynamics, and precisions have a more forgiving crit compared to the others. Spread shots obviously only have a 1.2 times crit because they're pellet based, and then the 1.6 times you see on the dynamic and precision is a little bit more forgiving. 180s are a little bit more forgiving than all of the other archetypes. And then finally, heavy bursts actually have a very unforgiving crit multiplier of 2.2 times, which is honestly definitely a noticeable downside if you've ever used heavy bursts. First of all, they are the only burst hand cannons, so they are maybe a little bit harder to hit all of your crits with, given that both shots come out very quickly, especially at longer ranges. And this definitely cuts into the usability of the archetype, and so that's definitely going to factor in later when we do some tiering, but just at least raw mathematically, heavy bursts are pretty good. Next, we have pulse rifles. So pulse rifles, they're ad clear score-wise. This is one of the most samey kind of weapon families in the game, especially when it comes to primaries. I've talked about this in previous archetype tier lists, but pulse rifles are basically all the same. They're like, the difference between heavy burst and balanced is like not really one that you're going to notice in terms of raw ad clear. And so we're going to focus more on the quality of life stuff. For example, like high impacts feel terrible. Aggressive bursts can kind of feel bad because 4 bursts are kind of hard to land all headshots within PvE, especially at longer ranges. And so some of that stuff is going to come into play when we talk about pulse rifles. But at least raw mathematic damage profile, you have heavy burst, aggressive burst, dynamic, lightweight, rapid, all kind of in the same tier, same space. And then you have high impacts, adaptives, and balance, which you can argue are kind of close to the good tier as well. So they're not even that bad. And the only thing I'll note here is that you might be surprised that a heat weapon is at the bottom of the pack, but balanced pulse rifles are kind of held back by their lower EDPS score. Something that Bungie did with some heat weapons is that they increased their red bar performance, but decreased their orange bar and yellow bar performance as a kind of trade-off. And so, yeah, I mean, the balanced archetypes, some of them are kind of like that. And so that's why the balanced pulse rifle is as low as it is, even though it's not that far from the rest of the pack. Next, we have scout rifles. So scout rifles, surprisingly, the high impact scout rifle is actually the highest score at 814 ad clear score. Kind of impressive given that it was one of the less favorable archetypes in the past. I think some buffs happened. I definitely retested the high impact because it just has different scalar values than the other scout rifles for some reason. I retested it like 3 times and I got the same result every time. So I don't know what happened there. But yeah, it is the best scout rifle archetype in the game. Now you can argue on whether it feels good or not. Obviously it's a 150 RPM, so maybe you are not going to enjoy how that feels versus like a 260 like a rapid. But that's kind of personal preference. In the decent tier, we have rapids. Classic rapid fire scout rifles used to be significantly stronger than the others. We have aggressive at 767, balanced. And then in the OK tier, we have lightweights and precisions, which is kind of to be expected from previous seasonal testing. In the note section, we have aggressives have significantly higher 1 mag minor DPS than other scout rifles because they are balanced by that kind of lever action, 1 shell, 1 shot at a time reload thing. Or I guess it's 2 technically, but yeah, 2 at a time reload thing. And so, yeah, they kind of compensate by having very high 1 mag minor DPS because of that stepped reload. And then precisions have very low 1 mag minor DPS for whatever reason. And then finally, my last note is that high impacts, rapids, and balanced scouts have less forgiving crit multipliers at 2 times versus 1.7 to 1.8 times on the other scout archetypes. Now, this doesn't really matter that much. It's not a really big difference, but I just thought I would note it because there is a difference, but it's one of the smaller ones when it comes to pointing out crit multi differences. Second last on our primary list, we have sidearms. Add clear score wise, this is as close as you're going to get to the spread shot. Excellent is going to be adaptive burst at 992. In the great tier, we have rapid, dynamic, adaptive, lightweight, and heavy burst. And finally, at just good, we have precisions at 852. You'll notice that even though precisions are the lowest of the bunch by a fair amount, all of these are pretty much viable, right? Like all of these have good minor DPS. So sidearms in general are like a pretty solid family of weapons, and they have been for a long time. And as you can see, you know, they're a relatively close clusters. So they're mostly going to be based on perks or feel or quality of life, as opposed to their damage profile for the most part. And then in the notes section here, adaptive burst, we have a bit of a less forgiving crit compared to the other sidearm archetypes at 1.85 times versus 1.6 on most of the rest of them. And dynamics here are going to stand out because they have a high 1 mag minor DPS value compared to the others. They naturally have a smaller mag because dynamics, you know, tend to generate a lot of heat compared to even other heat weapons. And so dynamics, if you're able to stay within the mag or play around DHL, I believe it's in like the 1100 range. So definitely an outlier in that respect, and certainly going to affect its ranking later on. Finally, the last primary family we're going to talk about is going to be SMGs. SMGs range from good to okay. You have the aggressive burst, which has increased minor scalars, I believe, at 824. You have lightweights, 802, nothing crazy there, nothing unexpected. Adaptives, balanced, and aggressive SMGs super close to each other in the decent tier. And then precisions at 600 RPMs. We talked about this in the past. Lowest fire rate SMG, not too great in PvE at 711. A small note here, aggressive burst has a very big mag at 64, I believe, max mag size, but it's going to be worse 1 mag minor DPS than the balanced SMG, which is a heat SMG. The only reason why the balanced SMG lost score here is because the manual reload is going to be slower than a traditional SMG, just because it's a heat weapon. Next up, we have our specials. Now, specials, fusion rifles, 1 mag boss DPS here. Yeah, not looking too hot, unfortunately. In the decent tier, we have high impacts at 893, and then in the okay tier, we have precisions, adaptives, rapids, and aggressives at, you know, anywhere between 800-ish to 840. And this is a big change from previous seasons, right? We had a moment where rapids and aggressives were the best. Rapids have been the front runners when it comes to fusion rifle DPS for a long, long time now. And then everything besides rapids and aggressives got buffed. And so we're in a really weird situation right now where high impacts have the highest total damage, as you can see, 31k versus 18 to 23k. For some reason, they get more shots as well, like 25 max, versus the other fusions, which get like 23 max. So we're in a weird situation where high impacts are just the best, like unequivocally, right? They have the highest DPS, they have the highest total damage. And yeah, I'm not really sure why that's the case. Fusion rifles in general are not super relevant, which we'll talk about when we come to the end of this video in the analysis section. But I just wanted you to know that at least within archetypes, high impacts are easily the best. They're easily the best. It's not even close. And rapids and aggressives are actually among the worst, which is interesting for sure. Definitely a change from what people are used to when it comes to fusion rifles. Next, we have glaives. Glaives are largely seen as a defensive tool. I mean, this season you can argue they're more of an offensive tool as well. But when it comes to add clear score, rapids are around 1k, aggressives are kind of floating in the same area, and then decent adaptives are like 100 below. But you know, this add clear score stuff doesn't really matter for glaives. Just something I thought I'd point out if you care about the raw damage profile of glaives. And then aggressives have decently more total than the others. You probably have noticed this if you've used the glaive in the past, at around 19k versus the 14 to 16k that is achieved by rapids and adaptives. Next, we have grenade launchers, which are all very diverse and different, I suppose. And when it comes to maximum boss DPS, so if all of these have like trickle charge and you could shoot them like salvo, micro missile would be at around 1279 DPS. You have double fire at 1259, very similar to each other, both with spike grenades. Implosion rounds was tested as well. Spike grenades was better in this case. And then in the decent tier, you have lightweights at 943. This is the salvo tier. I know a lot of people have been enjoying using trickle charge salvo. Unfortunately, micro missile, you know, if salvo was a micro missile and it had trickle charge, I think it would be a lot more of a meta contender, but certainly interesting as well to discuss. We have waveframes at 675. You're not really using these for boss DPS, but I just included the number here anyways. And then you have tick damage, area denials, 189 boss DPS, but obviously it's a tick weapon, so the total damage is going to be significantly higher here, as you can see at the bottom, 23k versus 17k, and it's also usable for ad clear as well. So not really going to mention area denial too much here. Very like special use case, so maybe not a relevant comparison. Next up, we have shotguns. Shotguns are a little interesting. A bunch of different archetypes got a bit of a quality of life buff, a bit of an uplift. 1 mag boss DPS wise, rapids and lightweights are basically neck and neck now, which is very interesting. Lightweights actually have slightly more total damage, but rapids obviously have a higher shot count, which is going to matter later on when we talk about the nuances of tiering them. Heavy burst and rapid slugs are also essentially in the same tier, almost an unnoticeable difference in DPS between these. Obviously, heavy bursts are preferable to rapid slugs because of 4 times the charm access, but we're not going to talk too much more about that. They're pretty similar. In the good tier, we have aggressives and precisions. I was kind of surprised to see aggressives this low. I thought they would be a little bit higher, but they are in their own tier below rapids. And it is actually, I would say, a significant step down compared to like the 1200 tier. That's a big difference, like 20%, right? So pretty big difference there. And then you have pinpoint slugs, which are at 944. Bungie's really neglected slugs since like year 4, year 5 because they were very dominant in that meta. And I think they've been scarred by the maybe perceived mistakes that they made having this shotgun archetype be so strong for a while. And these are completely neglected now, right? They have lower total damage. They are, terrible DPS wise. And these values, by the way, these DPS values, you notice in the last note bullet here, all non-pellets have a 1.755 times crit and pellets have a 1.1 times crit. But usually when you're using a pellet shotgun, you shoot the body. And so the boss DPS value I chose to use here was a body shot. And so in theory, if you were to shoot a precision pellet shotgun into a div crit, for example, you would be doing 10% more. So the difference would be even greater against the pinpoint slug. And so yeah, the pinpoint slug really left behind. And for my second note, you'll see heavy burst, aggressives, and rapid fire slugs are total damage outliers, especially with 4 times the charm access on the heavy burst there. But yeah, nothing too crazy, nothing too unexpected from last season. The notes on total damage haven't really changed. It's more that the DPS profiles of some of these upper echelon excellent shotguns have gotten a lot closer together, which is potentially interesting. Next, we have sniper rifles. So sniper rifles, 1 mag boss DPS. Obviously, dynamic snipers do 50% more damage per shot versus rapids. So they're sitting at 1555 on this 1 mag boss DPS level. However, I will say, obviously, dynamic snipers have their own little heat mechanic. They have a very small base mag. You have to play around DHL. So the effective difference between the two is definitely smaller than 50% in practice. In the good tier, we have rapids, aggressives, and adaptives, which are all very close to each other. 988 to 1030 is like almost an unnoticeable difference. So definitely a good job from Bungie in making all of these sniper archetypes a little bit closer together. And then in the bad tier, now I will say there's a little asterisk here. We have high impacts at 617. Now this is just base DPS with no loaders or anything like that. Just 1 mag boss DPS, just dumping it straight. However, you will note that high impact snipers they're like New Land Beyond, right? They're like New Land Beyond. And so they are able to be sprint canceled and they are impacted by reload duration multipliers as well as raw reload speed. And so reload canceling actually results in the high impact moving to 964. This is with Lunafaction boots, a reload at range, max reload, loader mods. And with all these things combined, I was able to get to 964 boss DPS, which is really in spitting distance of rapids and aggressives and adaptives. And I want you to keep that in mind, that these are almost in the same cluster tier of boss DPS when it comes to the actual tier list and my explanation as to my placement of the high impact sniper. Now, the other thing that you need to know is that the high impact sniper is an insane total damage outlier. It has more boss DPS total than the A499, which is a heavy weapon that is specialized in having a lot of total damage. So it's an insane total damage outlier. It doesn't even have 4 times the charm. And I assume in the future, if they were to make more of these, theoretical, if they were to make more of these, I don't even think they would put 4 times the charm on it because it just has so much total damage. It has 49,000 total damage. Rapids, aggressives, and adaptives, if they have 4 times the charm, they're hitting 25 to 33k total, which is essentially doubling their total damage. And it's still leagues behind the high impact sniper rifle. So this thing is essentially just a legendary New Land Beyond. That's what it is. It's a legendary New Land Beyond. And then dynamics, something important to note here is that their DPS drops disproportionately once you account for reloads, minus 34%, minus 30%. This is kind of like perfectly simulated. So in a real scenario, dynamics, you would drop definitely a little bit more than 34% versus the rapids when you account for manual reloads. So that's just a little something to note. Like I mentioned earlier, dynamics do have that heat mechanic you have to play around. But yeah, there is still quite a gap between dynamic snipers and rapid snipers regardless. And next up, we have heavy weapons. Now, GLs, 1 mag boss DPS, there's only 3 archetypes, right? You have good rapids at 1745. You have decent, which is going to be adaptives at 1634, compressed waves at 1583. So maybe it's a surprise to you if you haven't been paying attention, but compressed wave frames, they are pretty close to their heavy GL brethren. And so they're kind of decent multifunction GLs. The total damage between all of them is extremely similar. And I will say, just generally speaking, heavy GLs have abysmal total damage for the current sandbox, but we will talk about that more when we get to the actual tier list. But yeah, between the 3 of them, the total is actually quite similar. And ammo efficiency wise, because rapids, I believe, get the same amount of ammo per brick, they get less effective damage because they have higher total shots. And so if you get 7 ammo out of 35 on a rapid, and you get 7 ammo out of 28 on an adaptive, the proportional difference in the damage that you're going to be doing, given that they both have the same boss damage total or similar, rapids are just going to get a little bit less per brick. Next, we have linear fusion rifles. This one is kind of a travesty, honestly, because there's only 2 archetypes. You have precision and adaptive burst. And in the past, the way this kind of comparison worked is that adaptive burst would have slightly higher DPS. They would have more total, given that they don't have access to triple tap or 4 times, and precisions would be more total damage with 4 times the charm. Now the way it works is precisions have significantly, 1252 versus 1068, that's a big difference. They have significantly higher boss DPS, and they have significantly more total. Even without 4 times the charm, you're looking at 36k versus 33k, which is like, maybe around a 10% difference. And then with 4 times the charm, it's not even close. And so adaptive burst linears are a complete non-starter in the sandbox. And that's not even to say how good linears are in general. But even ignoring that, just looking within the 2 archetypes that we have, adaptive bursts are absolutely terrible now compared to precisions. Next, we have machine guns. Machine guns are like the pulse rifle of the heavy weapon world when it comes to archetype comparisons. They are all very, very samey, very, very similar. In the great tier for ad clear score, rapids are at 1766. We have good in terms of aggressives, balance, and adaptives, pretty similar. And then high impacts definitely trail behind like they always do at 1475. Aggressives, in my opinion, are probably the best balance between total damage and DPS because they actually have the same total damage as the adaptive, but they have higher DPS to match. So they're kind of like a spike upward. If we were to imagine a total damage versus DPS graph with all the machine guns plotted, aggressives would be an outlier, slightly trending in the upward direction. For the second note, I would say high impacts have a small total damage outlier versus the others at 44k versus 33 to 38k. I don't think this is like a huge difference maker in endgame content, especially with how plentiful ammo is these days, but high impacts, they're decent for other reasons as well. So I would say their DPS drawback or their ad clear score drawback is not the worst thing in the world, given that they have a little bit of higher total damage, which is why I mentioned machine guns are a largely balanced weapon family, much like pulse rifles. Next, we have rocket launchers. This is going to be taking their max boss DPS value, so shooting them back to back. In the excellent tier, we have aggressives and adaptives. Aggressives have a slightly faster fire rate if you're holding on the trigger and shooting them back to back, which is why they have a slightly higher score. High impacts do less damage per shot, so 1843, also have a lower fire rate. And then precisions have an even lower fire rate and lower damage per shot at 1623 boss DPS. Now, a note here is that high impacts do have higher total than aggressives and adaptives at 26k versus 23k, which can come into consideration when it comes to like ad clearing or total rocket count for like a conquest or something like that with like bipod. But for most situations, especially for boss DPS, not really worth considering, in my opinion. Total damage, not really the biggest concern on rockets. You're mostly going for burst. And so as a result, high impacts, not really worth. Next, we have swords. Swords are interesting. I'm going to throw something up on the screen here. I did a lot of testing recently on sword combos. I tested 1 heavy, 1 light, light spam, heavy spam, 1 heavy, 2 light. I tested a bunch of different possible combos on every single sword archetype: bequest, adaptive, caster, wave, lightweight, aggressive, vortex. And I used those values to figure out what is the best combo in every single archetype and what the DPS was. And not really surprising, but bequest still comes out on top at 1428 due to its inflated impact stat and slightly higher swing speed. You have adaptives, casters, lightweights, and waves, which are essentially all identical in DPS with their optimized combos. If you're curious about their optimized combos, they will be in the sustain tab in the spreadsheet later on when I update that. But for now, if you hover over the notes section in the archetypes tier list, you'll see that a lot of these are like 1 heavy, 1 light. Or for wave, it's actually just spamming heavies. So that's potentially interesting. And then in the bad tier, we have aggressives and vortexes. Bungie buffed vortexes and made it so that their heavy attacks only consume 4 ammo instead of 6. Unfortunately, I did say that vortexes need a heavy damage buff or they need a overall DPS buff in order to compete, and they weren't given one. And so as you can see, they're still trailing significantly behind the rest of the pack except for aggressives. Note-wise, I will say lightweights, waves, and aggressives have more total damage than the other archetypes. The others are all hovering at around 30k, whereas lightweights especially are at 42k, and then waves and aggressives are trailing slightly behind. Total damage is generally not a super big concern with swords. This doesn't even account for relentless strikes. But regardless, just maybe something small to note. Finally, I want to talk about any archetype that doesn't really fit cleanly into the boxes of like auto rifle or bow or anything like that. And that's going to be some of our special stuff. So we have the high impact bow or the crossbow at 2171 max BDPS compared to against rockets. This is pretty high, like we mentioned before. Next, we have the dynamic special hand cannon, or the blaster as some people call it, reaching an ad clear score of 2100, which is quite impressive compared to like the spread shot at like 1300. I will say something about the blaster is that it has a 4 times crit multiplier, which is the highest I've seen on any gun in this game. Insanely high. So if you are to ever hit a body shot, or you have the misfortune of shooting an enemy that cannot be crit, for example, like a shank, or maybe some sort of object-based objective like a blight, you are going to be in trouble with this weapon. I think its minor DPS drops like 350 or something abysmal. For a special weapon at least, when it comes to ad clear score. So that's something important to note. I think the quality of life on this weapon is pretty strong, right? A lot of people do enjoy using this weapon, but I think I would make the argument that a lot of other ad clear weapons are a lot more potent. And speaking of a lot more potent, let's look one line lower at the micro missile pulse rifle, Rocket Pulses, with an ad clear score of 2500. A similar total damage value to the special hand cannon, even when you're hitting all crits with the special hand cannon. And yeah, this thing is just insane. Its effective crit multi is like 1.1 instead of 4, which is, I don't think I need to tell you, is a massive difference. It obviously has splash damage as well, way easier to use. And then of course you have the 1 mag boss DPS, which I need to bring up because obviously rocket pulses got nerfed, and I don't think I need to tell you that they're bad, but like 702 1 mag boss DPS is abysmal, terrible. And so yeah, I hope that kind of settles things in case you were wondering if rocket pulses are any good for boss damage. We have rocket sidearms, which achieve an ad clear score of 1166, maybe surprisingly disappointing, but if you use rocket sidearms versus rocket pulses, or even rocket sidearms this season against some of the better primaries, they don't really feel that different. So rocket sidearms, yeah, their ad clear score not that impressive. I honestly think maybe they would deserve maybe a small buff or something like that, but certainly not terrible. 1166 is certainly serviceable, but for a special weapon, maybe not as high as you might think. And then finally, we have trace rifles, which have their own little section here at 903 ad clear score. Certainly serviceable, not bad. It's up there with some of the top sidearms, but nothing too crazy, especially for a special weapon. But given that they're essentially a special ammo auto rifle, not hating on that too much. So now that you have a good understanding of what auto rifle is the best, or what scout rifle is the best, let's talk about what interactions these weapons have with various elements of the sandbox, including artifact mods, set bonuses, exotics. Auto rifles, you have targeting autoloader, which is a big one, up to 20% increased damage and 40% refill on kill. Sustained fire gives you effectively permanent 2 times resist or 25% DR. I believe it's non-stackable though. And so auto rifles, yeah, these are going to be increased by 20% on their ad clear score, which will affect their ranking when we get to the actual tier list. Actium Warrig and Please Hurt, I just mentioned these because they exist in the sandbox. I don't think they're that meta or like more likely to be used. I mean, Actium Warrig is class exclusive and forbids you from using a potentially better exotic for neutral. So for the most part, you're looking at the top 2 here. Bow's Argent Quiver is pretty impactful. 35% increase to any sort of archetype is enough to move the needle for sure. Semi-auto striker guarantees that you essentially have permanent Argent Quiver uptime. You have Moby's Quiver, which is like 150% damage increase for primary bows, which is I guess interesting. I'm going to do some bow testing stuff because Hierarchy of Needs change I think is potentially interesting, which is mentioned just below that as well. And then you have Bushido 4Ps or Unfaltering Focus, which gives you resist ×1 on kill. Not really relevant, but I thought I'd mention it because it is part of the sandbox, I suppose. Hand cannons, no artifact support, just Lucky Pants up to 450% damage. Scout rifles, you have semi-auto striker giving you permanent armor charge, but no real like global booster mod like Argent Quiver. You have Please Herd, which is a 2-piece set bonus, which is currently bugged as well. So it's certainly not relevant, but I thought I'd mention it. Sidearms, maybe you forgot about the Mechaneer's Trick Sleeves damage boost. You get double damage if you're crit HP. Unfortunately, I don't think this is super relevant, but I thought I'd bring it up. Same thing with Please Hurt as well, bugged. We have SMGs, Peacekeepers up to double damage, but no other forms of global support from the sandbox. Next up, we have our specials. Fusion rifles are going to get particle reconstruction up to a 28 almost percent debuff. And then you have a 10% mag refill. Compendium reached out and told me that particle reconstruction, the refill effect, like the amount of shots required to trigger the refill, is quite nerfed on a lot of weapons this season. It's obviously still good on 1K and apparently on aggressive fusions, but on a lot of fusions, it's not as potent as it used to be. At least the refill effect isn't. However, particle reconstruction is going to incentivize maybe some people who are doing solo stuff to use fusion rifles to achieve a debuff that they normally wouldn't be able to get as easily, especially not one as high as 28%. Glaives have a ton of support in the sandbox. You have Hold the Line for HP sustain. You have Nobel for free additive melee damage bonus and ammo. Passive Aggressive Guard for 25% melee DR for close range enemies. Suppressing Glaive for suppression on hit. You have Triton Vice as a hunter exotic that synergizes. Balestra and Sesso Tempo, 2 set bonuses from the same set for exhaust on hit and resist ×4 on guard block. So very, very strong defensive and offensive profile support for the Glaive here. Grenade launchers, you have Force Absorption, which is Ion Adapter 2-piece. Very familiar with that, I assume. We can clear 15% debuff on hit with a long internal cooldown, as far as I'm aware. We have Micro Missile frames, so Micro Missile Sidearm, Micro Missile Pulse, to some degree Micro Missile GL as well. Energy Acceleration, Unstoppable Shockwave, just makes the splash effect of these weapons even just a little bit more potent. Force Absorption, like I mentioned, and then Hazardous Propulsion, I suppose, gives you a up to 35% empowering buff. I don't think this is a relevant exotic, but I just mentioned it because it is part of the sandbox, I suppose. Shotgun's the same thing. If I didn't mention no backup plans underneath the shotgun list here, I think I would be crucified. I don't think it's very relevant given that it doesn't stack with Boots of the Assembler, but it is a thing, I suppose. Sniper rifles, you have Semi-Auto Striker for permanent armor charge, Sniper's Meditation, which means we're going to be multiplying the boss damage score here by 15%. You have Incendiary Rifle rounds, mostly for Still Hunt, but in case you're using like a Solar Legendary Sniper for some reason, that's also going to give you ignitions from time to time. And then Trace rifles, we have Cenotaph Mask, which refills over time, and I think maybe the most underrated thing on this entire page, which is Harsh Refraction. A 50% damage increase to debuff targets. If you're using like a Destabilizing Rounds Legendary Void Trace, this is like an insane boost to Trace Rifle ad clear. Trace rifles were already solid, if you remember, at around 900 ad clear score. This is going to bump them all the way up to like like 1350, which is like insane for what is essentially like an auto rifle. So I think trace rifles are pretty slept on. And the artifact that harsh refraction comes from is not even bad. It's like Tablet of Ruin, which is pretty good. So yeah, I think harsh refraction, this interaction is quite underrated. I haven't really seen much people talk about it, but yeah, pretty good stuff. Next, we have heavy weapons. High impact bows get Argent Quiver. If you're doing some sort of envious arsenal rotation, it does eat armor charge very quickly. So you'll need like the Vogue set bonus or something like that in order to keep your orb uptime very high, keep your Argent Quiver uptime very high. But besides that, yeah, it does technically get a 15% damage increase. We have grenade launchers, heavy GLs. Only difference here between specials and heavies is that it included kinetic impacts, which is technically like a boss damage increase, but doesn't stack across the fire team when it comes to the counter. And the shockwave itself is very small amount of damage. So I don't think it's super notable, but it is an artifact mod that technically helps. Linear fusion rifles, yeah, like we talked about before. Particle reconstruction to an even stronger degree with heavy linears incentivizes people to use them for like solo content where they can't get that, big debuff on maybe other heavy weapon types. Machine guns, you have heavy ordnance regeneration for constant sustain. You have hold a line for, again, more HP sustain. And then Actium Morg, like I mentioned earlier, not really the most relevant exotic, even for Titans, but I suppose it does increase machine gun damage to some degree and also gives you a refill effect. So that's kind of nice. And then rockets and swords. Yeah, a lot of stuff here. I mean, for boss damage, it's basically just going to be Argent Ordnance, 15% damage increase. But if you're going to use these for like a conquest or something like that, I think these are very strong. You have blast radius for permanent armor charge, which gives you effectively permanent Argent Ordnance uptime. You have heavy ordnance regeneration for free DR, free ability regen, a little bit of disorient as well. You have perpetual destruction, which gives you like infinite ammo. You have anti-champion nose cone, which is excellent for specifically, I would say, conquest. And then I guess I'll mention Hasbro, even though I don't think it's a relevant damage buff, again, for the most part, because maybe if you're doing like roam content, but for boss damage, certainly not, given that Boots of the Assembler is so easily accessible now. And then finally, we have swords. Swords, we've covered these mods in the past, because they are from past seasons. And Sword Storm combo, combination Argent Blade, all increase sword damage technically by like a little bit. So I've multiplied these into the sword boss damage score value. We have Blade Stamina and Iron Lord's Vigor, which are kind of DR and ammo regen effects. We have Combat Meditation, which has been responsible for creating some nade spam strategies in the past. You have Blade Focus, which is a 10% damage increase if you do like a slow guard combos. So technically, if you're doing sword damage to a boss and you're not on Wolfsbane and the boss damage phase is like really short, like you're nuking Crota down or something, and you have time to like block ahead of time, it's technically the optimal set bonus to run, but yeah, pretty niche. You have Balestra and Stesso Tempo for neutral content. Great on like Ergo, great on like the lightsaber. And then you have Healing Initiative, which is the 4-piece Warlords Ruin set bonus. I don't think it's that good in general. And even with swords, which are probably the best applicator of the initiative effect, yeah, it's not that great. But I thought I'd mention it because there is some synergy there. Now that we've talked about artifact interactions and the like, I want to talk about champion stuns. Now, obviously, for actual champion stuns like stunning an overload, stunning a barrier, stunning an unstop, fairly obvious, right? A lot of different legendary archetypes have different stuns now. However, I will note maybe 4 things. So the first thing is that Barrier is most likely the most valuable champion stun now. Now that there is essentially no way to get Barrier from a subclass effect, it's easy to jolt an overload or ignite an unstop using your subclass, using your abilities, but there's basically nothing that can stun Barrier champions. And so as a result, a lot of the time when you're running like a conquest or something like that, if you don't have a Barrier weapon on you, you're kind of screwed. So that makes Barrier a little bit more valuable. On top of that, Barrier, I guess I'll talk about it first, has enemy shield bypass in general. So even if you're not playing against champs, anti-barrier weapons can bypass stuff like Hobgoblin immunity when they crouch. You have Knight shields that can be bypassed, Phalanx shields that can be bypassed, Hydra shields that can be bypassed, those rotating shields. And so all of this is kind of relevant when it comes to endgame content for a lot of weapons and dealing with some enemy types that are more annoying. And so Barrier might be the most valuable intrinsic at a general level. Now, as for the other stuff, we have Overload. Now, Overload, it doesn't actually exhaust enemies when you shoot them and overload them anymore, at least. You don't get the visual effects, and the enemies don't have their damage output reduced by what I believe was 25% before, so not a very useful effect. However, they do count as exhausted for one thing, and that is Elemental Supercharger. And I would assume Photonic Flare as well, but that's not as strong of an effect. So for those of you that don't know, Elemental Supercharger gives you additional super energy when you defeat an exhausted target using a weapon that matches your super. And so this is really, really strong, by the way. This is one of the strongest ways to farm your super. If you don't believe me, put on 3 Pale Heart weapons or weapons that are compatible with Dealer's Choice and use like No Hesitation or any other overload weapon from that set and just kill stuff. And you will see your super go up in massive, massive chunks. And so Elemental Supercharger, this has already had some implications in like speedrunning and other endgame content where we are literally looking for specifically weapons that are overload in order to get as much super as possible in a short amount of time or in a small amount of kills. And so this has already seen some endgame applications, but generally speaking, if you're not trying to like farm a super as quickly as possible, and that's not like the purpose of your build, then yeah, overload weapons don't really do too much. They do almost nothing, I would say. And so yeah, that they're maybe like the least useful overall champion stagger, champion stun effect to have on your weapon as an intrinsic. And then finally, Unstoppable. So Unstoppable is really interesting. I want to talk about the concept of enemy staggering. So you'll see that Unstoppable, the intrinsic, is that enemies stagger more easily. And the way stagger works in Destiny, I don't think any really content creator has covered this. I was planning on testing it at some point, but with end of service being a thing, I maybe won't. But yeah, I don't think any content creators really tested how stagger works. But the way stagger works is that enemies have a threshold of damage that you need to reach before they get staggered naturally. And having Unstoppable on your weapon reduces this threshold. High caliber rounds also further reduces this threshold. Stopping power also further reduces this threshold. And so having all three of these combined can make it so that even in ultimate tier content, you can stagger enemies really quickly. When I had high cal and I had Unstoppable on a high impact machine gun that I was using, I was able to stagger orange bars in the ultimate shooting range, like in 2 or 3 bullets. It was very, very fast. And while the ability to stagger enemies quickly in most endgame content is not super valuable because you tend to just kill them, I can see it being useful maybe on like a certain primary with high cal that's like high impact or has the unstop intrinsic. And if you're using like a primary in some sort of very hard content where the enemies are quite beefy and you want to just be able to stop them from shooting you because you're not going to kill them very, very quickly. So it definitely has some use. I would say definitely more useful than Overload, but certainly not as universal as Barrier. Just something that I thought I'd point out because I think it's interesting. I haven't really seen anyone cover the concept, and I did a minor amount of testing with my friend Spider for specifically because we were trying to figure out if the intrinsic was worth ranking weapons higher for example. So now that we're done talking about Sandbox interactions, I want to bring your attention to the actual tier list itself, so the analysis. And we're going to talk about quickly what these tiers actually mean. The tier lists are going to be split up into a boss damage section and an ad clear section, because some weapons are clearly designed for one over the other. There's some that kind of double dip and do both, but for the most part, they stick to one side, right? And so for the S tier, I really want things, I've mentioned this in the past, my S tier is quite exclusive. I want it to be really game warping stuff, the true definition of S tier, okay? And so for an ad clear weapon, it has to be a weapon that fundamentally changes how you play the game. So for an ad clear weapon or a boss DPS weapon, it needs to fundamentally change how you play the game. Maybe it changes a part of your loadout to be more flexible than it normally would be. Maybe it is so powerful that it means that you have to sustain yourself less through some degree because you're killing things so quickly, or you're killing bosses so quickly or something like that. In the A tier, we have very good but niche, or maybe slightly worse in the S archetypes. They're like alternatives a little bit. In the B tier, we have solid damage profile, but not really relevant. C tier, we have almost no use case, completely outclassed. And then D tier is like non-starters. Some of the archetypes in the D tier are actually actively hindering your gameplay rather than benefiting you. And so that's going to be our tier definitions. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start looking at how I've ranked things. So first up, we have the S tier. And like I mentioned, the S tier is pretty exclusive. There are 2 weapon archetypes in the S tier as a whole, 1 in each category. In the ad clear section, we have the micro missile pulse rifle, rocket pulses. Game warping levels of ad clear, nearly 2 times the damage per brick versus a blaster who has a similar amount of ad clear score at around 2k. This is running at like 2400, and a very forgiving crit multiplier, right? Would you rather shoot a wyvern with a rocket pulse, or would you rather shoot with a blaster, right? It's a big difference. I mean, I don't know. Rocket pulses in this ammo economy, they change how you play the game. They're ad clear level, right? If you go, once you go rocket pulse, you can't go back. You can never go back, right? Because if you go from a rocket pulse to like a really, really good primary at like 1k ad clear score, you are reducing your damage output to red bars by 2.5 times. You're going to take 2.5 times longer to kill enemies. And in upper level content, it's almost as if Bungie needs to unlock a new tier of content that makes enemies hard to kill again. Because rocket pulses make it so that red bar, orange bar, even yellow bars, they just melt. They just melt like butter. They just melt like butter. And all you need to do is just dump rocket pulse into them. You just hip fire it into them. And so they just change the game fundamentally how it's played. You don't need as much survivability because your rocket pulse just nukes everything. It just nukes everything. And if you have high lethality, you also have high ammo, and high ammo means high uptime. And it's just an endless killing loop, right? It just changes the game fundamentally. You can never really go back once you start using rocket pulses. In the boss damage section, we have the Disruption Sniper, which might not be class leading for DPS, the rockets, and you have the crossbows, which have a higher ceiling, but the versatility that the Disruption Sniper brings for endgame content is just so high, right? Unless you're optimizing a kill to be like a speedrunner, or you're going for like a really tight one face or something. If you're just playing to play endgame content to like complete the content consistently, whether you're in LFGs or whether you're doing like some sort of day one, there's no day ones anymore, but if there were day ones in the future, A499 would be a core part of your loadout because not only is this thing extremely ammo efficient, has tons of total damage, you're unlikely to run out of heavy during damage as well.
It's just insane versatility for mechanics as well. It's barrier, so you can shoot through like Hydra mini boss shields, for example, if they spawn in. And for mechanics, it's like it one-shots everything, right? You have a Cyclops, you're playing on, like if you're playing like 5 feet Epic Apophyes, for example, you look up, there's a Cyclops, bang, he's dead at the cost of 1 heavy ammo. And in terms of proportional, like how much ammo you need to use to kill like a big target, rockets might not even do as much damage per shot, by the way. And they use like a 9th or a 10th of their ammo every single time you want to kill something. Whereas the sniper here versus like even like the crossbow, which is its direct competition, uses way less ammo per shot. And so, yeah, it might not be, like I said, the class leader for DPS, but it's just so versatile and so brain dead and so easy to bring to everything that I think it does deserve the S tier because of how it changes the game to that degree. Next up, we have the A tier, which is just going to be one slide. In the ad clear section, we have the area denial grenade launcher, excellent on-hit synergy, great splash ad clear, good ammo efficiency like we mentioned in the past, and solid boss swap potential too. If you want to use it to proc Envious Arsenal, you want to use it to gain Transcendence, you want to use it just to do some tick damage to the boss while you do damage with another weapon, like it's just good. It's just good all around. Jack of all trades and master of some, to be honest. The rocket sidearm, it's definitely outclassed by other specials, specifically the rocket pulse, but I would say it still has a very high quality of life and good kill perk synergy. So for example, like heal clip is really good on it. Anytime you need to kill an individual ad and create some sort of splash effect off of it, rocket items are excellent at that. And it's a little bit more fine-tuned, I would say, in terms of ammo usage compared to the rocket pulse, right? Instead of having 14 shots, you have like 35 or 40 or something like that. And then, you can decide to use your ammo a little bit more sparingly compared to the rocket pulse. And so there's definitely some places where the rocket sidearm, especially with the right perks like repulsor destabilizing, can still be very strong. The adaptive trace rifle is here, and you might notice that I probably in previous seasons, given the damage profile, would have put this in the B tier, but harsh refraction makes the trace rifle just so much more potent, right? Harsh refraction makes it so that the adaptive trace rifle does more minor DPS than a rocket sidearm. Remember, ad clear score on the rocket sidearm was around 1166, I believe. And with harsh refraction, trace rifles are up near 1350, which is a lot higher. And so not only is the trace rifle even more fine-tuned in terms of ammo usage than the rocket sidearm, it's even more forgiving to use because you can miss as much as you want, really, compared to the rocket sidearm and the rocket pulse, where if you miss, it's like more of a big deal, I suppose. And it's just very high utility for shot count sensitive use cases like shooting buttons, shooting objectives. Rocket pulses, if you have to waste an ammo shooting a button, that's 1/14 of your ammo gone. Trace rifles, that's like 1/500th of your ammo gone, right? So trace rifles are very, very useful in a lot of endgame content where you just need to shoot buttons or shoot objectives or shoot buffs or something like that. Pretty useful for that. In terms of boss damage, we have a bunch of different options here. We have the high impact bow, which I mentioned earlier. The crossbow lacks the versatility and quality of life of the disruption sniper, but I would say it has a higher potential ceiling than rockets due to Mobius Quiver and Argent Quiver also being in the artifact this season. You have the micro missile grenade launcher. By the way, these are not ordered in any particular way, so just be aware of that. Essential movement tool, and the swap damage profile honestly isn't terrible, even if these things were not really, really good for vertical movement, which is relevant in a lot of endgame content. Their damage profile in general is not that bad. I'd probably put them high B tier if I was ranking within tiers. Aggressive rocket launcher, insanely high swap DPS, requires galley, has good artifact support for roam. I think it's quite underrated, but it's a little singular in use, right? It's basically just for burst damage, whereas you can say the heavy sniper, it can be used for roam, it can be used for champs, it can be used, I guess the rocket can be as well, but I would say the heavy sniper is a little bit better in that respect. Adaptive rocket launchers, they are a little bit worse than aggressives in terms of raw fire rate, but it's not different enough for me to bump them down to B tier, certainly. Rapid fire shotguns, best quality of life archetype for any sort of melee strategy. Certainly if you're doing something like the Song of Flame Winter's Guile thing, this is probably the best archetype that you can use given how fast you melee. And then also has the highest 1 mag DPS, which is very important when it comes to picking the right shotgun for like the Cascade All-Star thing, which I don't even think there is another shotgun that gets Cascade All-Star, but if there was, like a lightweight or something, you'd probably still take the rapid. And then Dynamic Sniper is held back a little bit by its small default mag, but this thing just has insane damage per shot, right? Like a rapid fire sniper that just has like essentially a 50% damage perk all the time is insane. And when you use this thing even in neutral, right, just running around and trying to shoot crits in like an encounter or something, it breaks them so quickly just because of its raw damage profile. So it's just overtuned to hell and back. And because of that, I kind of have to give it A tier. And it's obviously great for boss damage as well. Next, we have the high impact sniper rifle. This might be a surprising entrant because I know a lot of people have talked about the Helmsman. Not a lot of people have tested the Helmsman. And so I do want to talk about a theoretical scenario here. But first, let's talk about what it's objectively good at. First of all, this thing is excellent in terms of per shot damage. It's basically a legendary New Land Beyond, which I'm sure if you use New Land Beyond during like Desert Perpetual Day 1, during Corregos, for example, how useful it was for just having an excellent ammo economy and still being able to shoot a ton of crits on the boss. And anytime there's some sort of crit objective, for example, Gall Run these days, the Helmsman is great for stuff like that. It's very likely to be able to one-shot crit objectives with the health thresholds that Bungie tends to give on them compared to some of these other snipers. Instead of using 2 shots, you just one-shot it, bang, you're done. Also, another thing with snipers is that rapid-fire snipers maybe have a little bit of problems with one-shotting ads in more difficult content. High-impact sniper, no problem whatsoever. Easily one-shots the ads. It's kind of like the perfect damage threshold level for just being able to one-shot ads from a distance. So very, very helpful with that. And then the total damage is insane, right? It's like Heavy Sniper Deluxe. It's like Heavy Sniper Deluxe. This thing is everything I said about the Heavy Sniper. This thing is not barrier, so it's a little bit of a downside there. But everything I said about the Heavy Sniper basically applies to this as well, right? Where you can just run around and just expend ammo and just one-shot everything with this thing when it comes to anything that's not boss damage. And then finally, I will say, even for boss damage, remember how I said this thing is like 964, all the other legendary snipers are like 1k? If this thing got double damage perks, which I think in the future, if Bungie were to continue developing Destiny and adding updates, I think they eventually would make one of these with double damage perks because, it doesn't need 4 times the charm, right? If you look at a gun like Praedyth's, it has like 13, 16k total damage without 4 times. This thing has like almost 50k without 4 times. And so it doesn't need 4 times. And so it's a much better scenario to run double damage perks. So in theory, I'm saying in theory here, because snipers have had double damage perks in the past. In theory, if it were to get double damage perks, explosive payload is not one of those, by the way. It reduces your damage. But if it were to get 2 damage perks, it would be one of the best snipers in the game for legendary DPS. Anyways, enough glaze on the high-impact sniper. I think it's pretty good. I don't think it's like game-changing or anything, but it's pretty good. Pretty useful for sure in a lot of encounters. And so yeah, I decided to give it an A tier. Next up, we have the B tier. B tier is going to be quite a few slides. It's the biggest tier by far, which makes sense. It is the middle tier after all, or one of the middle tiers. For ad clear, we have high impact, adaptive, and support auto rifles. Adaptives are the best auto rifle in the game. They have barrier intrinsic. They have the best damage profile. So yeah, just the best overall. High impact auto rifles have a little bit more range, and they also have good stagger access because they are unstoppable, right? And they also, a lot of them get high caliber rounds. And I would say an auto rifle is one of the better weapons to be trying to stagger enemies with compared to maybe some of the other primary and special weapon types. When it comes to just being able to shoot ads repeatedly, I think the high impact auto rifle is pretty solid. And the damage profile is very good, right? It's like very, very close to the adaptive, basically unnoticeably different for a decent chunk of additional range. Support auto rifle I put in the B tier. Even though the damage profile is a little bit lower, it's still definitely serviceable, and it can also boost damage of your teammates, which is relevant in some cases. And also, it's good for survivability with stuff like physics. So support auto rifle, shout out to that guy. Also going to be in the B tier. Then we have precision bow, which is going to be a step up over the lightweight and the high impact, like I mentioned. Might be surprised to see it up here with the autos and some of the other top tier primaries. And that's because of Argent Quiver. With Argent Quiver, this thing's DPS, I think, approaches almost 1k. It's like 936 or something. So it's actually quite solid. And unlike a lot of the other weapon types here, this thing has infinite range. It has the barrier intrinsic as well, which is great to have on a weapon like this, on a bow. Has great artifact support and excellent kill reload perk synergy with stuff like Volt Shot and all these other kind of kill reload perks that you tend to see on bows these days, which Bungie is handing out like candy. Glaive wise, I think all of them are very strongly supported by this artifact, by this meta. If you are going to use a glaive, which, in a lot of endgame content, some people tend to not use glaives because their defensive utility is not as valuable. But if you're going to use a glaive and really play into it, I feel like this is the best season ever to really be doing that. And so, yeah, I mean, all of them, I think when it comes to glaives, aggressives are technically the best, but I don't think all of them are different enough to really make me want to drop one or more of them into the C tier. So, because, for the most part, when you pick a glaive, it's mostly for like the origin trait and like the perks. And the archetype is like secondary unless 2 glaives are truly equal besides like the archetype. And in the boss damage column, you might be surprised to see the precision linear. So yeah, I will say Bungie has finally done it. They have buffed a linear enough and given it a sandbox with particle, etc. To make it so that if you want, like if you're like a solo player and you don't have a div and you're not like sitting in a Luna well all the time, because the A499 is quite reload sensitive, as I'm sure you know. And if you don't want to do that and you just want to use particle, you don't want to use solo op, you don't want to like stack kills or anything, the precision linear, it's not bad. It's honestly not bad. The total damage is pretty competitive. Even without 4 times, it's still pretty good. So if you want to like double dip on damage perks or something, it is an option. But yeah, it's not terrible. With particle access, easy debuff. I think it's notable for solo, to be honest with you. It's not the worst thing ever. And so yeah, I wanted to give it a shout out in the B tier. Maybe a little bit high, but I thought the C tier was maybe like a little bit low for it. So it would be like low B tier, maybe the bottom of B tier if I was ranking within tiers. But yeah, it's just showing up first tier because these are not in any particular order. Rocket launchers, we just have the high impact, right? Additional total damage versus the A tier rockets, but it's not really ever beneficial. I did mention though, it is probably better for roam content if you want to use like a bipod rocket or something like that. It's probably better for that kind of content because of the increased shot count. Next, we have lightweights and heavy bursts. Now, lightweight shotguns are a strict downgrade from rapids, in my opinion, because a lot of the time with shotguns, especially if you're using them for like 1-2 punch, you want a higher total shot count, even if the damage per shot is lower. And the DPS profile between these two it's like essentially identical. So there's no real reason to use lightweight shotguns, in my opinion. Their swap DPS is also lower than aggressives, so it's just going to be in the B tier, just strictly off of its like raw damage profile. But in terms of actual use cases, it's not that great. And then heavy burst shotguns, best sustain / total combo shotgun archetype. Just doesn't have the same versatility as a rapid because just inherently it's not a pellet, so you don't use it with melee stuff. It's just a 4 times a charm kind of sustained damage weapon. I will say it's not that relevant because sniper's meditation and 4 times a charm snipers are a thing, but it does exist, I suppose. We have aggressive shotguns, slight downgrade in DPS versus the top shotgun archetypes, but it has pretty good total damage, and the damage per shot, if you need a one shot like a mini boss in low level content, for example, in speedruns, aggregate trench found verdict is used right now in like throne first encounter to one shot the mini bosses. So for stuff like that, you know, aggressives are kind of irreplaceable, and it does have high swap DPS. So I'm going to be testing some parasite aggressive swap stuff in the future during this season when we go to rotations. So look out for that because aggressive shotguns do in fact have the highest damage per shot, which makes them the best swap DPS option for shotgun DPS. Next up, our second B tier slide, we have in the ad clear section, waveframe grenade launchers. They definitely feel less efficient than area denials in pretty much all content, but still fairly lethal. And if you ever need to clear enemies in a line, and you need to kill them quickly, which doesn't matter for most people, but in speedruns, sometimes waveframes are better than area denials because area denials do take a while to tick down the ads that they kill, and sometimes you gotta kill ads as quickly as possible, and so waveframes are a little bit better for that kind of stuff. And then we have both dynamic hand cannon variants, the primary and the special. The primary version is essentially a regular 180 RPM hand cannon that's a heat variant, slightly worse damage profile than the top sidearms that are neighboring this weapon, but has slightly longer range to kind of make up for that. You have the special blaster hand cannon, solid ad clear score like I mentioned, but insanely unforgiving crit multiplier, and the ammo efficiency is not as good as something like Mint Retrograde. You have the spread shot hand cannon, biggest standout primary damage profile, but it's a little unwieldy and certainly has range limitations. So it's definitely more of like a personal taste thing, but definitely rewarding if you are willing to stick it out and play with the spread shot hand cannon. You have the 140 and 180 RPM hand cannons, which are, like I mentioned here, similar range tier as the adaptive auto, but they don't need autoloader ramping. So they don't need targeting autoloader. Even with targeting autoloader in the mix with the auto rifles, their damage profiles are not that different from these 140 and 180 RPM hand cannons, which is why they are in fact in the same tier. For boss damage, we have all 3 sniper rifle archetypes because they're realistically damage profile-wise very similar. We have rapid fire's classic DPS sniper archetype, not that far behind the dynamic in practice, but certainly worse overall. We have aggressive snipers, which are held back by the lack of access to 4 times a charm, but kinetic synthesis basically means that you don't really need that anymore, which makes them a lot more competitive. Adaptive snipers are almost identical to rapids in damage profile, but they also have the barrier intrinsic, which makes adaptive snipers honestly a lot more relevant, and they can achieve a max size of 7, just like rapids. So if you have a 4 times a charm plus damage perk adaptive, it's honestly not even that bad. Kind of depends on the role, obviously, and you know now it comes down to like perks and origin traits, and Praetus is just the king when it comes to that. But the barrier intrinsic is actually quite helpful to run during mechanics. And then you have sword archetypes, adaptive, caster, lightweight, and wave, which we talked about. Bequest, I'm not going to give adaptive swords like a leg up because of Bequest, but Bequest actually does compete with heavy GL 1 mag dump DPS with better damage perks, and it has the best overall profile when it comes to damage. But the other adaptives, they're not that different from like casters, waves, and lightweights. Casters we talked about are the best when it comes to like nade spam on hit strategies with like, you know, the Sage Protector 2-piece set bonus. You have wave swords, which are actually a step up in total damage without really losing a significant amount of DPS versus the other B tier swords. These are all kind of in the same neighborhood when it comes to damage profile. And then you have lightweight sword. Lightweight sword, actually, I would recommend over the wave sword because it is more consistent to hit targets with, almost impossible to miss with lightweight sword with the combo that you use. And it has the best ammo efficiency and economy and is essentially the same DPS as the wave sword as well. So lightweight sword, pretty good as well. But for the most part, if you're going to use a sword, I would just recommend Bequest. But yeah, these are, if you're curious, where I would rank these sword archetypes in the tier list. And then finally, we have our third B tier page. Again, biggest tier on the tier list. For the actor section, we have 4 of the 5 machine gun archetypes, and that's going to be everything but the rapid, which we'll talk about in a second. So aggressive machine guns, best balance of DPS and total amongst LMGs. You also have the stagger intrinsic, which I think is good to have on a machine gun specifically with unstop. Adaptive machine guns, which are technically a strict downgrade to the aggressive damage profile, but you have the barrier intrinsic instead, which can arguably be more useful than what you have on an aggressive. You have balanced machine guns, which have a niche for being the highest 1 mag dump potential, which is useful if you are ever needing to shoot a bunch of stuff and not reload. So basically callous skulls. Yeah, it's basically for callous skulls. If you want to use like an LMG, the EQ LMG bitter end is probably the best one. It's basically just a higher quality of life rapid fire machine gun. And then you have the high impact machine gun, which has the highest total damage, doesn't lose that much DPS against the others, and also has a stagger intrinsic. Feels a lot more stable at range than a lot of other machine gun archetypes as well. So it might be a preference thing whether or not you use it versus the aggressive. Then we have 4 sidearm archetypes. We have the adaptive burst, the adaptive, we have dynamic, and we have rapid fire. These are all kind of interchangeable. They have small quirks that differentiate them, but they're all very good. With the adaptive burst, you have excellent overall damage profile for close range primary with a barrier intrinsic on top as well. The adaptive sidearm is if you just don't like burst sidearms in general and you just want to use something that shoots straight, for example, like a Drang, this still has the barrier intrinsic and quality of life preference, like I mentioned, could lean towards this. So it's not that big of a difference in terms of damage profile. Dynamic sidearm is a 1 mag DPS nuke. If you shoot, for example, compact defender at enemies, it just nukes them compared to like most other primaries because the 1 mag DPS, if you don't account for DHL or reload, is just very high. Also has a good supercharger pairing because it's overload. And then you have the rapid fire sidearm, which has a similar ad clear score to the dynamic sidearm, not accounting for that 1 mag stuff, and also works with supercharger. They're both overload, so they're both kind of interchangeable. The rapid fire sidearm is essentially the non-heat version of the dynamic sidearm in terms of damage profile. Okay, let's move to the C tier. The C tier for ad clear, we have the balanced auto rifle, which is basically strictly a downgrade from the adaptive. It's just worse in every way, in my opinion. We have the precision auto rifle, which has a worse damage profile than all the other auto rifles, but it does have the barrier intrinsic, and the drop off is not that big. We have the rapid fire auto rifle, which kind of surprising because it's used to be the best auto rifle by a fair margin. It has a solid damage profile, but it's a strict step down compared to the adaptive in the exact same range tier. It just does less damage, and it also doesn't have the barrier intrinsic, opting for the overload intrinsic instead. We have the lightweight bow, which I mentioned earlier. It wastes the draw time floor and feels a bit weirder to use than the precision, and notably has no barrier intrinsic. We have the heavy burst hand cannon, which has a good damage profile, but low base stats, which means that if you're just roaming and using it neutral, the reload is going to be pretty slow, especially if you don't have any reload boost built into your subclass or on the weapon itself, and it has an unforgiving crit multiplier, which can be kind of annoying. We have the rapid fire LMG, which has a good damage profile, but definitely has some mediocre total damage, and it definitely has the worst recoil control issues of any LMG frame, which at range definitely reduces its effectiveness and effective DPS. Next, on the boss damage section of this slide, we have the high impact fusion rifle, notably the only fusion rifle in this tier because it's the strongest standout for body/range quality of life DPS. Very easy to use, big step up over the other fusions. I still don't think it's that relevant. I still think at a closer range you should probably just use like a shotgun or something. But yeah, if you want to use a fusion rifle, this is like the only one that's even remotely relevant. We have the double fire grenade launcher, which is technically the best blinding archetype, but not really super relevant overall compared to the micro missile. If the micro missile got blinding, this would be just a completely dead archetype. We have the rapid fire grenade launcher, the heavy one. Awful total damage versus other meta power options. The DPS is pretty decent, but the only niche it has really is like Cascade Point. So if you're going to use it with like Cascade Point and damage perk like the Vesper GL, the VS Chill Inhibitor, that could potentially have some merit, but besides that, just as a default option, not really worth using at all, especially given the lack of artifact support. Adaptive grenade launcher basically is in the same situation, similar to Rapids, just slightly worse DPS and a little bit more total, not different enough for me to kick it down to D tier. And then we have the compressed waveframe grenade launcher. Ad clear versatility is a little overrated due to the poor ammo economy, and damage profile is actually surprisingly okay. I'm actually testing something with the compressed waveframe grenade launcher where you actually shoot a boss directly, and the impact of the projectile hitting the boss actually does a significant amount of damage. And so if you can find some sort of boss where you can shoot it directly, have the wave projectile bounce off, and still hit the wave consistently, this thing could step up quite a bit in terms of damage. However, I will say, the ad clear thing, this thing actually, compared to like a rocket pulse even, right? It's just not that efficient when it comes to like brick pickups. It's not that efficient when it comes to like shots versus ads killed. So while people do tend to say that this weapon is like a little versatile because of its ability to deal with ads a lot better than the rapid and the adaptive, I honestly don't think that's that big of a selling point. Next, we have the precision rocket launcher, which is a significant step down in damage profile versus other rockets due to its fire rate and also damage per shot. So I left it in the C tier. It is still a rocket overall, so like Argent Ordnance still makes it like okay and like I guess somewhat usable, but it's not very good and I don't think you should use it. And then we have the rapid fire slug shotgun, which in my opinion is literally just a worse version of the heavy burst. None of them have access to 4 times a charm at this given moment. It has a lower DPS, lower 1 mag dump DPS. Just no reason to use the rapid fire slug in my opinion compared to the heavy burst. And then next up, we have the second, I believe, C tier slide. We have a bunch of pulse rifles in this tier: heavy burst, lightweight, rapid fire, and dynamic, which are essentially all in the same boat, which is essentially just a worse high impact auto rifle. The auto rifle has a similar range tier at, I believe, around 35 meters, and it just has targeting autoloader access. It has that support from the artifact, and it just does more damage. It just does more damage. And so as a result, there is no reason to really use a heavy burst, lightweight, rapid, or dynamic pulse rifle. And the adaptive pulse rifle, it's a small step down from the other C-tier pulse rifles, but it has the barrier intrinsic, so I was willing to let it hang with the others. But at the same time, it also kind of has the same issue as the others, where it's just worse than auto rifles, right? It's just worse than like an adaptive auto rifle. Heavy burst sidearm is strictly a downgrade from the adaptive burst sidearm, so I left it in the C tier. There's no real reason to use it. We have lightweight sidearm, which is similar damage profile to the adaptive sidearm and feels quite similar as well, but it lacks the barrier intrinsic, and so I dropped it a tier for that. And then finally, we have the precision sidearm, which is the worst performing sidearm when it comes to add clear score, which is the strict downgrade from the adaptive sidearm. They both have the barrier intrinsic, but the adaptive sidearm is just better objectively from a damage profile standpoint. And then finally, on the right side of the screen, we have boss damage. We have the aggressive sword. It's a decent downgrade in DPS compared to the other archetypes, and doesn't even really have the highest total. The lightweight sword has a significantly improved damage profile, and it has even higher total damage as well. So yeah, not really any reason to use the aggressive sword. Well, if you are comparing apples to apples, at least when it comes to perks and origin traits and whatnot. Next up, we have our D tier. Our D tier includes a bunch of the worst performing pulse rifles, including the aggressive burst, which is arguably worse than like the heavy burst because of its 4 burst nature, more difficult to hit all your crits. The balanced pulse rifle has a similar damage profile to the adaptive, but doesn't even have a barrier intrinsic, which is why I moved the adaptive up from this tier, even though it kind of belongs here from a damage profile standpoint. High impact pulse rifle just has lower quality of life, famously lower quality of life versus the other C tier pulses, and the damage profile is starting to drop off to be a noticeable difference between this and like the C tier pulses. Scout rifles in general, as you can see here, have lower quality of life at closer engagement ranges, which is where most of Destiny's combat tends to happen. Long gone are the years where we would be in GMs and sitting and plinking at enemies from like 200 meters away. I have distinct memories of using like a rapid hit explosive payload like Vouchsafe and like plinking at inverted spire GM enemies like goblins like from like 200 meters away. We're not in that sandbox anymore. So scout rifles are definitely a lot worse these days. And of course the high impact scout doesn't have any barrier intrinsic. The lightweight scout, the rapid fire scout, again, basically just suffering from mediocre damage profiles. And the rapid fire scout, like I mentioned earlier, surprisingly has a worse damage profile than the slower firing high impact, but the difference between their add clear score values is not that big, and they essentially have the same issues. Now we come to boss damage. Precision fusion rifles are the only archetype in the D tier for the fusion rifle family, and that's because they're only useful if you want a lower charge time on your fusion rifle for some reason over the high impact. So let's say you're using a fusion rifle for champs, and you're using it inside of the context of like a conquest or something like that, then maybe you want a precision fusion rifle because the high impact just has a really, really long charge time. And so if that's the case, this is like the best of the garbage. It's the best of the lower charge time fusion rifles. And so I'm not going to recommend any of the other fusion rifles because they're all strictly worse. They have lower total damage and they have lower damage per shot. They have lower DPS than the precision fusion rifle. And so there's 0 point in using the others. And so yeah, I decided to put the precision fusion rifle in this tier just as like the highest performing, not long charge time fusion. We have lightweight grenade launcher, which has some use as like high quality of life, high handling, high swap speed, blinding GL, but yeah, very outdated damage profile, just strictly worse than pretty much every other GL frame available. You have the adaptive burst linear fusion rifle, which is just worse DPS than even upper middle special weapons, and no access to ammo return perks, just strict downgrade from the precision linear fusion rifle like we mentioned. You have the precision shotgun, which famously was the worst shotgun archetype in the past. It no longer is, in my opinion. But it just doesn't have the total damage or the damage profile to compete with aggressives, or let alone like the top of the table shotguns like the rapid. And then you have vortex swords. Vortex swords, yeah, their buff was definitely not enough. Still among the worst total damage and solidly in last place for DPS. Kind of close actually to the aggressive for DPS, but the total damage is just really not there, even after the buffs this thing received to its heavy attack ammo consumption. And then next we have the second page of our D tier, which is going to include a bunch of other miscellaneous primaries. We have the high impact longbow. The entry draw time requirement upon first contact with enemies is definitely noticeable. The stagger intrinsic is kind of nice, but definitely not like the best weapon to be taking advantage of it. You have all pretty much of the SMGs. The adaptive SMG is a strict downgrade from the precision auto, and so is the aggressive SMG, and so is the balanced SMG. The aggressive burst SMG actually has a similar range tier to some of the longer range sidearms, but no barrier intrinsic to match, and also just a strictly worse damage profile. Lightweight SMG is similar to the aggressive burst SMG in terms of damage profile, but it has higher quality of life and a slightly worse damage profile overall. And then you have the precision SMG, which does have the barrier intrinsic, but it is the worst SMG damage profile. So yeah, the barrier intrinsic saved it from being in the F tier. It's certainly not great when it comes to add clear score though. Finally, we have the F tier, which I think I didn't even mention in the tier slide, but I wanted to make a separate tier for some of the stinkers, okay? Pretty small tier, but for add clear, we have the aggressive scout, the precision scout, and the aggressive hand cannon. The aggressive scout has a mediocre damage profile overall, and when you combine it with its unwieldy kind of reload mechanic, honestly, I would think it hinders gameplay a lot of the time compared to some of the other scout rifle archetypes, which themselves are not already in a good spot when it comes to endgame PvE. And then you have precision scout rifles, which are the single worst damage profile when it comes to legendary primaries. They are significantly worse than the majority of the sandbox, and they are, when it comes to ad clear score, the lowest ranked on this list. And then we have aggressive hand cannons. Aggressive hand cannons with their low fire rate and kind of low pour base stats, significant underperformer compared to the other hand cannons, and the intrinsic that it has certainly doesn't make up for it either. Finally, the last section of our tier list, the right side of the F tier, we have boss damage. This is where fusion rifles go to die. We have adaptives, aggressives, and rapids, which I mentioned are basically just strict downgrades from precisions. There's no reason to use these over precisions outside of like perks and origin traits really making the difference. And then we have pinpoint slug shotgun. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, right? Year 4, year 5, heritage, first and last out, super meta. And these days, the pinpoint slug shotgun has worse DPS, worse damage per shot, and worse total than a body shot equivalent precision pellet, which itself is not a very good shotgun to begin with. It's a pretty bad shotgun to begin with. So slug shotguns are really, really, really neglected in this sandbox and are genuinely pretty terrible, in my opinion. They've been left behind a lot. Now, mathematically speaking, I mean, they're not as bad as the fusion rifles because they are slugs, right? But they're still like pretty poor performers, in my opinion, and very, very disappointing, very underwhelming compared to what you might expect from them. And the trade-offs, I guess, of having to hit crits or whatever. So yeah, not impressed with those. In the next slide, I'm actually going to give you guys a summary, if you're not interested in listening to like the justifications and stuff, a summary of where every single archetype in the sandbox sits in terms of viability, right? Just a raw kind of qualitative analysis. And so let's go ahead and take a look. So primaries. Auto rifles are pretty good overall. In terms of mid-range, they're definitely like the best primary type, I would say, for most people. With targeting autoloader, sustained fire, especially, I would say, adaptives, high impacts, and support auto rifles, other archetypes are largely downgrades. Bows, you have Argent Quiver support, which gives you massive sustainable damage bonus, competes with other top primaries, and precisions are definitely a cut above the other two frames. If you're a bow user, you probably already know how decent bows are this season. And if you're not a bow user and you're in an encounter and you want to use a primary for like mid to longer range, bows are definitely pretty good this season. Hand cannons, despite the lack of their artifact support, are still very potent when it comes to damage profile, especially 140s, 180s, both types of 180s, and most notably spread shots. Other frames are not as enticing, especially aggressive hand cannons, especially 120s. Now you have pulses and scout rifles, middle to bottom of the pack in every aspect. There's no unique artifact support, and I would say no real reason to use pulses or scouts. Scouts just use a bow instead, pulses just use an auto rifle instead. Sidearms are class leaders, even without explicit artifact support, much like hand cannons. Highlights include adaptive bursts and dynamics, but every sidearm archetype is fairly usable, even precisions, which are the lowest by a decent margin. And then finally, we have SMGs, which, if you ignore perk selection, are some of the weakest combinations of damage profile within their range tier. With SMGs and, weapons in general in Destiny, if you have to be close range to use them, there tends to be a trade-off where they do more damage. SMGs are kind of the exception to this rule where they are close range like sidearms, occupying the same range tier, but their damage profile is pretty bad. So they're largely outclassed by sidearms in usability and damage profile. Obviously, SMGs are good users of attrition orbs, but I think if sidearms also had attrition orbs, I think people might use sidearms a lot more. But just in general, I've had a lot of endgame players that I've convinced into using sidearms, and they're realizers, they're noticers. They have realized that SMGs are really not that great, especially given there's just no artifact support for them this season, which certainly doesn't help either. Okay, next we have special weapons. So fusion rifles are almost certainly the worst special archetype family in the game. Mediocre total, terrible DPS, poor ad clear potential, and high impacts are the best by far, but still don't even compete. Glaives are plenty strong this season, artifact support, defensive tool, offensive tool, very, very versatile. They're a little situational, obviously, but excellent in the right scenario, especially if you build into them. Grenade launchers are very diverse, so it's kind of hard to give you a summary of all of them, but area denials and micro missiles are very unique in their use case and are kind of irreplaceable. So they're good on a per weapon and per frame basis, but I wouldn't say they're like excellent on the whole or anything because they're just very different. Shotguns, very specialized damage option. Surprisingly, in theory, you would think that a shotgun does more DPS than a sniper, but with Sniper's Meditation, they're actually quite similar, shotguns and snipers, when it comes to boss DPS. So, they don't really outdamage longer range options without some sort of special help. So, for example, Cascade Point All-Star on that threat level. And, you need some unique perk combos, to beat out snipers. Rapids, aggressives, and heavy bursts are the standouts, and pinpoint slugs are absolutely terrible. Sniper rifles are boosted by Sniper's Meditation this season. Every single sniper frame has been buffed into viability. Rapids, aggressives, and adaptives are all very similar when it comes to boss damage profile now. And the other two archetypes are plenty useful as well, of course, with Conspiracy Honed or the Dynamic archetype being very strong for burst damage. And then you have the High Impact, which is very good for roam. Trace rifles, I would say, are quite underrated, maybe one of the most underrated things in this entire video. Harsh Refraction's 50% boost makes these a top primary competitor. I would say, honestly, I would rather use a Trace Rifle over a Rocket Sidearm for a lot of stuff these days, just because of that raw damage profile, as well as benefiting their original niche of being a special swappable high shot count weapon. So Trace Rifles are already naturally going to be relevant in some endgame content just because of that concept of being a high shot count swappable weapon. But, this makes them very competitive as well for just regular ad clear. So pretty good from Trace Rifles. And next we have Heavy Weapons. Heavy GLs outside of weapon-specific double damage burst options like the Cascade Point thing I was mentioning earlier, these are completely outclassed by rockets, crossbows, and disruption snipers. Total damage is abysmal by 2026 standards, and the DPS is just middling. Linear fusion rifles, I would say precisions are a huge cut above adaptive burst. Their total damage is impressive, and particle support, of course, invites casual solo usage. But even in solo, like if you're willing to get solo operative stacks, yeah, I mean, linear fusion rifles, I don't think there's any real use case for them in like optimized content. But for easy, just kind of casual use, I think linears, especially precisions, are not bad. They're pretty decent. Machine guns, excellent artifact support in the Tablet of Ruin artifact, decent damage profile even though they're eclipsed by rocket pulses, and solid ammo efficiency. Unfortunately, in a lot of content, you are going to be trying to use a power weapon that does more burst damage, more boss damage, whatever it is, more versatile movement, whatever it is. So machine guns kind of struggle to find a use case given that they require your power slot. But if you're willing to use them, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. Rocket launchers have class-leading swap DPS, widespread artifact support for both roam and for boss damage. Damage potential is very rotation sensitive, so we're going to be revisiting rockets versus crossbows, for example, in the future when it comes to damage rotation stuff. But yeah, certainly still a lot of total damage issues though, compared to disruption sniper and crossbow. But these days, with the amount of multipliers we have to our damage, total damage is not that big of a concern. Maybe in a day one, it might be for like a really, really long phase. Rocket launchers are maybe not the best for that. But besides that, still a pretty strong pick, still a top pick. Swords, even with Argent Blade, struggling to find a niche in the current damage meta, even though a target needs to be grounded and melee damageable for you to use a sword. This thing is still outdamaged by the majority of available burst options in the form of rockets or in the form of the crossbow or in the form of A499. Still outdamaged by a majority of these options. So swords, yeah, not in the best spot ever. Similar situation as like heavy GLs. Finally, our last summary slide, we have the misfits that don't fit into the convenient little boxes of the other slides. Micro missile pulse rifles, rocket pulses, leagues above every other ad clear option. Score-wise, Ammo Sandbox is perfectly capable of keeping these topped up as well. Rocket sidearm is definitely a little bit underwhelming compared to the past. Kill reload effects, like I mentioned, have good synergy, but certainly not like a class-leading pick. High impact bow or the crossbow, another rotation-sensitive option, in theory has a higher ceiling than rockets when it comes to burst DPS, but raw archetype analysis, which is what we've done in this slideshow, doesn't really put one strongly over the other. And then finally, disruption sniper rifles, extreme versatility, guaranteed barrier access, good synergy with current artifacts, and excellent ammo economy makes this an easy S-tier pick, which we mentioned in the previous slides. And that's all she wrote. That's it for archetype discussion. This is the last time I'll ever be doing this. I think the sandbox is it's in a decent spot, certainly interesting. At the very least, we can say we have an interesting sandbox. Lots of interesting, weird, quirky damage rotations that are popping up. And it's not like the content is like super hard or anything, so you don't need to be hyper optimized. You can use a bunch of stuff and have fun. So I'm kind of glad that this is the state the sandbox was left in, and it's not like super brain dead. Everyone's using one thing. I guess A499 kind of qualifies, but it's not that bad. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I know this was quite a long one, but if you stuck around, thank you. Appreciate your support. And in the coming days, we will be finishing the primary, special, and power weapon tier list and updating the shopping list for those of you who have been asking me a lot for that one. I know it's a bit late. I'm sorry. But we will get it done. We will get it done, and we'll get it done right, hopefully, the first time, because this is, in fact, the final patch. And with that, I bid you farewell. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.